Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is City of Heroes. Let's rant with Scrapperlock. We are with Psyop, who is our level 16 character. We're now pretty much immune to all the mez attacks. We have our hold defense. It's going to drain our endurance a little bit, but that's okay. We're in pretty good shape on that, and as a stalker, you can stop and rest a little bit by just going back invisible. So we're going to stop Nocturne, and I've got hopefully the right inspirations I'm going to need to do that. And we should be okay against her because, again, stalkers are, kind of playing the game on easy mode a little bit. We get that first strike with a big, kind of alpha strike on her. So that should be not too bad. And as we go, it's time for our next rant. And today what we're going to be talking about is the importance of constraints, and that you need constraints for fun gameplay. And the people who are asking not to have constraints are highly, in my opinion, highly misguided. So let me talk about where this comes from. This comes from two sources. As I've said before, sometimes there's like a confluence of watching or listening to videos or talking to somebody, and as part of that, I realized that two things are connected that I hadn't really been thinking about before, or it just brings the concept to the forefront of my attention. And so two things. First, I was watching a video that had some comments. I think it was comments in the video, or maybe it was somebody made a comment in a Discord where they were talking about DMing, and they were talking about giving players freedom to do things. And one of the people who posted as a player was saying that what he wants as a player out of the DM is leniency and flexibility. Be lenient with the rules and be flexible. Why? To allow him to basically have the quote-unquote freedom to be creative and to do what he wants with his character, right? He feels like this gives him agency. Now, we've talked about agency before, and what this person is describing is not agency. It's quite the opposite. But in the agency video, I was talking about consequences. And this person wasn't talking about being free of consequences. He was talking about being free of restrictions. And that's not exactly the same thing, right? It's a different thing to say you or your character can't fire your longbow this far because it's too far for the range. And quite another to say, well, if you do fire it, there will be this consequence, right? And so he's saying he wants leniency and flexibility. And I thought about that, and I thought, no, that's not what you want in a role-playing game. What you want is to have... Oh, we got a boss here. Let's try doing without inspirations. What you want is to have constraints, because the constraints give shape to the story. Being able to do whatever you want is what little kids do when they do Let's Pretend, and they don't create an actual narrative that looks like a real story because there are no constraints, and narratives have constraints, right? The constraints are what generate the conflict, and the conflict is the story, right? Stories don't happen without conflict, right? Without conflict, you kind of have nothing. And so as I was sort of thinking about this, I've been watching the Great GM channel. Guy Scanders, I think his name is, has a book that's just come out about GMing, and he's turned the book into a series of videos that you can watch. And they're quite informative, and I can highly recommend them, and I think he's very, very good. Now, he's not talking about players, right? He is talking primarily to GMs about how to game master a game and do a really good job of it and make it a game that a campaign that will go on for a long time, that your players are going to keep wanting to come back to, and that you and your players will love and remember fondly in future years after playing it, right? How do you make a really great campaign? And one of the first pieces of advice that he gives, and he keeps reminding you in the various videos after giving this advice, is the first thing you need to do when you're planning to set up a D&D or Champions or a Rolemaster game or whatever, the first thing you want to do in a role-playing game is set your constraints. He's very clear about this. You can't start with everything, right? You can't create a world in any kind of seriousness that's every theme and every time period and every genre. It doesn't work. When you try to dump too many genres into the same thing, it falls apart. You can't be creative in a space like that because you don't have any framework to use to generate that creativity. And so he said the first thing you need to do is come up with the constraints. Constrain yourself to a narrow subset of all the possible storytelling themes and devices you could use. So maybe you're going to constrain yourself to say, we're playing in the Wild West. You're going to play Deadlands then, right? Maybe you're going to constrain yourself to saying that that we're going to do a swords and sorcery type set of individual, non-related modular adventures. Maybe you're going to constrain yourself to say that that we're going to mostly have mysteries, or that this is going to be a campaign about palace intrigue, and we're going to be in this giant like city like Lankmar, and we're actually never going to leave the city. We're going to stay here, and all the adventures are going to take place in this one city, and we're going to be doing like palace intrigue and guild intrigue and stuff like that. Maybe you're going to run a story about a group of assassins that work for an assassin's guild, and all of the adventures are going to be murder missions, right? Missions where they have to go take somebody out. When you do that, you then open up the creative possibilities by giving yourself a set of criteria that you can use to pick and choose stories that will fit the idea that you have, and the ideas will then flow. So what Guy says is, for the game master, folks, the game master, not the players, the game master, who's the one who's running everything, who's the one who supposedly has all the power, who can do whatever he wants because he's the quote-unquote deity of his world. The first thing that Guy advises you to do is to give yourself constraints. Limit yourself. Don't be doing everything. Limit yourself to a small subset of possible options, and then use those to help you come up with ideas and generate a coherent set of world building parameters and adventure ideas and campaign ideas and so on and so forth, right? This is the point. In order for it to be coherent, there has to be constraint, right? If it's not constrained at all, you end up with incoherence. That's what like these gonzo settings are like, and even those have sets of constraints. But in a more traditional setting, you have constraints. Like your character can't do certain things. The NPCs can't do certain things because the world doesn't work this way. There's a physics to it, or there are rules to the magic. Right? Instead of just hand waving, magic can do everything, you give rules to the magic. Well, every time you cast a spell, there's a chance your character might go unconscious or something like that. And that provides you with something to roleplay about. Right? Otherwise, you don't really have any guidelines for your roleplay. And it's just like you're traveling down a road, right? If you're trying to get to a destination, you need to constrain which turns you take and which exits and entrance ramps you use, and where you stop and where you turn left and turn right. You have to constrain yourself to going only on certain roads in order to get where you need to go. If you can just drive anywhere and you're driving south, you won't go north. And so this is the same idea. Having constraints gives you the ability to travel in a direction, which is how you build a narrative and you create a story. Without that, you're going all over the place. And if you just think about, imagine like a random number generator where you're on squares, right? And it's equally likely that you can go in any direction, right? This is called a random walk. Random walks don't get you anywhere. You will cycle out slowly from the center, statistically, but they don't quantitatively go in any particular direction. A random walk all by itself doesn't go anywhere. You just end up like this. You can't get somewhere, right? The only way to get somewhere is to constrain yourself. I'm going to head to the next villain. Well, that gives me a direction. Now, this person was talking not about narrative constraints, I don't think. He was talking about rules constraints, right? I want to be lenient with the rules. But even there, the rules give you something to roleplay about, right? If you know that your character can't just snap his fingers and kill an enemy, but has to get within melee range and draw a sword and stab him, well, that is something to roleplay about. You're roleplaying about your approach. You're roleplaying about the drawing of the weapon. You're roleplaying about the attack. And if you miss, then you roleplay that you missed. And that's where the story comes from. So I think it's a myth that somehow having a lack of constraints improves the player's ability to make a story. That's not true. Your story comes from the constraints. And if even GMs need to be constrained, need to have limits on what they're going to do, then players do too. And think about this game, right? One of the constraints is you're in this city. Look at the here. We're not in an actual city zone, but right there. All those blue walls, those are constraints. Now, those constraints were there because when they built the servers, they couldn't have people flying all over the place without being kind of divided from each other because the server would crash. You don't really need to do that now, and they have more modern ways to do it, but these walls kept the zones apart, right? However, they're in-character zones. There's a lore about why these walls were put up. And so if you're actually going to roleplay in character in City of Heroes, if you're actually going to roleplay, then this is something to actually roleplay about. And we used to roleplay about the war walls. It didn't harm our roleplay that this constraint was in place. It just gave us something to roleplay about. And I think this is one of the real myths of modern present-day role players, is that they think any possible limitation on their options is automatically going to be bad, and they're not just bad for the character, but bad for them, right? Anything that makes their character slightly weaker, slightly less capable, is automatically something that as a player they shouldn't like, they shouldn't want, they're not happy about it. It's like everybody wants to be Superman. Able to leap tall buildings, fly, bounce bullets off their chest, see through objects, see through walls, able to heat vision, x-ray vision, frost breath, like every superpower that could exist, Superman has, pretty much. And it's like every single player wants to be Superman with his character. But that's not, being able to do everything might make you powerful, but it doesn't provide an interesting story. And if you actually look at the structure of most good Superman stories, right, well done ones like the ones from, I would argue, the first season of Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, that was a really good TV show, and a lot of those first season episodes were great. The second, third season, were terrible, but the first season had some really good episodes, and one of the things that made it so good was that the challenges that Superman has to overcome, this is also true in the Adventures of Superman TV show, it's also true in Richard Donner's Superman movie, in the original. The challenges Superman's overcoming are challenges that where all of his powers don't count. He has to actually use his wits as a normal, like kind of quote unquote human wits. He has to use his intellect and problem solving ability and his ability to to make friends and to be with colleagues, right? This is how Superman solves most of his problems in the TV show, rather than just bending bars and breaking down doors. Because since Superman is so powerful, if the challenge was just not to get blown up, that's not a challenge for him. So they generally don't use that as a challenge for Superman. Instead, his challenge is that Lex Luthor is taking over the Daily Planet and firing all the employees, including Clark Kent, and Superman can't just go in there and beat him up. I mean, he could, but it would be illegal, and Lex Luthor would just sue him and get him thrown in jail. Right? And Superman would have to obey the law because he's a law-abiding citizen. So the storyline gives constraints to the most unconstrainable character there is. You can't shoot him. You can't imprison him. You can't hide anything from him. You can't make anything too hot or too cold for him. You can't keep up with him. You can't punch him. None of that works. But Lex Luthor beats him financially. Superman doesn't have super economic powers. It's the one thing he doesn't have. And that's the constraint. Right? So by putting a constraint onto Superman and making it so that Superman can't use his overpowered abilities to solve the problem, they force Superman to outwit Lex Luthor. Right? And this happens at the end of the first season of Lois and Clark, where Lex Luthor got the Daily Planet and took control of it, and James Earl Jones comes in as something like and buys the company or something at the end, and they had to rebuild it because I think that the Daily Planet got destroyed. The building got damaged or broken or whatever. Like I know the giant planet symbol on the top was on the ground somehow, and I don't remember the whole storyline, but it was a storyline about how Superman could have flown into Lex Luthor's penthouse and just killed him, broken his neck, snapped his neck with just his thumb and his forefinger. Physically, he could have done that. But Superman's not allowed to do stuff like that. He won't allow himself to do stuff like that. And now he has to embrace his code against killing and his lawful behavior, right? And he has to find a way within those constraints to defeat Lex Luthor. That's a much more interesting story than I fly in and kill him. Right? I fly in and kill him is 5 minutes, and what are you going to do with the other 35 minutes of the show? Right? And this is what players don't seem to understand. I mean, building champions characters, they always wanted to have every power, no weaknesses. It's like, that's not interesting. It's much more interesting to have actual constraints on your character and to have to solve problems within those constraints. That's the challenge. Taking off the constraints, being lenient and flexible, is getting rid of the challenge. So when a player says, I don't want any constraints, what they're really saying is, I want God mode, I want easy mode, I want Superman mode. I want to be Superman. Right? And look, I played Supergirl as a character in Champions, and I think I've told this story before. And she had the highest attack. She had really high strength. She had the highest attack in the group. And the reason the GM allowed it was because I constrained her, because she's protective of innocent people. As a psychological limitation, I told him she is never going to attack an enemy in the first shot with full strength. Even supervillains, because she can't be 100% sure that that supervillain can take a full strength blow from her, because she's so powerful. So what she used to do was she would pull her punch, which makes it harder to hit in Champions, and it does stun damage, but it does less body damage, so she can't like break somebody's jaw with a pulled punch. So I didn't just do a pulled punch either. I did a reduced strength pulled punch. So instead of doing her full, I think it was 60 strength punch, I did like a 30 strength punch. right? And the other players are like, "What are you doing? It's a supervillain. Go ahead and use your full strength. We're using our full strength." Nope, she's got to test it first and see if he can withstand her blow. And if he can withstand a 6d6 pulled punch, then she'll go up to 10d6 and try a pulled 10d6 punch. And if he can withstand that, then she'll go up to 12d6 as a pulled punch. And if he can withstand that, then she'll do a full 12d6 punch, right? And my friends are like, but it's the end of the battle before you're doing your full strength punch. Two things. First of all, that's the only reason the GM allowed it in a 10d6 campaign. And two, I gave myself that constraint because it was more interesting. And you're like, oh, but you're hurting the group by doing this. Guys, we never lost a fight. Not once in the whole summer that I played this character, I don't know, 3 or 4 times a week, not once did that superhero group lose a battle because Supergirl was pulling her punch, or lose a battle at all, right? And certainly pulling her punch didn't do anything. All it did was allow me to roleplay a character's protective of innocence psychological limitation, which is the constraint under which she was operating. The constraint was the roleplay. This is what people don't understand. They seem to be saying, I want you to be lenient and flexible so that you're not constraining my roleplay. And what Guy is trying to say, and what I'm saying is, the constraints are the roleplay. That's what you're role-playing about, is the constraints of your character. Not having constraints, there's nothing to role-play about. So I urge people to reconsider if you're someone who's railed against the constraints and the limitations that get put upon you as a player. If you're someone who wants to be able to use the rule of cool to just do whatever you think is awesome and heck with the rules, this is cool, let's just do it. I urge you to reconsider and think about how useful it can be to have constraints, to have limitations, boundaries on what you can do. Players don't seem to like boundaries, but it's the boundaries that give you the story. Let me give you a great example. And I'm going to bring this up because I was just watching the final episode of the Deadlands 5-season playthrough on the Saving Throw channel with the Wildcards group, and they actually talked about this episode. They all said that their favorite session was Season 3, Episode 1. They thought it was the coolest ever of the whole 5-season, 60 or 70 episode series. The one all of them kept bringing up during the talkback, including the GM, was Season 3, Episode 1. Season 3, Episode 1 began with the GM saying to Dom Zook, who was playing the gunslinger named James Bogue, he set the scene. It's a dark night. There's a small train with an engine, 3 or 4 cars, and a caboose going down the tracks in the dark. And you get the sense that it's kind of not supposed to be here, right? And as it's going down the tracks, he said the camera pans up, and on the caboose, on the roof of the caboose, is James Bogue, sorry, went the wrong direction here, who is the gunslinger, right? Dom's character. And so Dom's character is on the roof of this moving train. And what the GM said was, why are you here? He let Dom decide why James was on the train, right? So that is giving him freedom and agency. And he said, well, this guy that I'm hunting I heard that he's on the train and I came looking for him. And the GM said, okay, then he's on the train, right? That's why you're here. But here's the thing. He still said to Dom, you are on the roof of this train. He put Dom on a literal railroad track and said, you are on the roof of this train. Dom had no choice about that. He was severely constrained. His character couldn't be anywhere else. He couldn't say, well, I don't want my character to be on this train. No, that's a constraint. You're on the train. And Dom loved it, and he said, "Well, I'm on here because I've heard that the bear, who is the Baron's right-hand man, right? And this is the Baron is somebody Dom's character had been hunting all along. I'd heard that he's on this train." And then a little while later, the GM said, "Okay." Dom was like going up the train, and like he defeated some guys in the caboose, and then he headed to the next car, and he looked through the window, and he said, "Okay, as you look through the window, you see it's a fancy car with a bunch of well-dressed people, and in the car is Rosaline, which was Megan's character." And then he said to Megan, "Right now, she's in the car. That's a constraint. You're in the car." He said, "Why are you here?" Right? And then Megan, out of the blue, had to come up with why her character was also on this railroad. Again, it's a railroad. She's in the car with these well-dressed men. Why are you here? And she said, "Well, I also heard that the bear was on this, and I thought I could help James out by trying to get some information." And her character is a lady of the evening, so she was using her feminine wiles. So she role-played herself like sitting on the lap of the one guy and flirting with him and so on and so forth. Right? And then the other two guys were in the front car. And he said, "Why are you here?" And they decided that the one guy was a boxer and the other guy was his manager. And they said, "Well, we're here because we're going to a boxing tournament, and the train is taking us to the boxing tournament." And the GM said, "Okay." So there are other boxers in the railroad car. So now they're giving the GM constraints. The GM now had to make up a bunch of boxers and funny names for the boxers, right, to be in this car, and generated rivalries between them and between some of them and the player character who was the boxer. And that was a constraint, right? They had to be in this car. The players were constrained to being in the car together, and why were they there? And the GM was constrained to putting boxers in that car, right? The GM, by the way, was also constrained to putting the bear on the train, because he didn't know the bear was on the train until Dom said, "I heard the bear was on the train, and that's why I came here." So now he had all of the, as I understand it, he had all of the lieutenants of the bear, and there were 4 of them: the Wraith, the Surgeon, the Scorpion, and the Bear. He had them all statted out. And so when Dom said the bear is on this train, the GM pulled out that character sheet and said, "Okay, he's on the train," right? And he had a couple of other, like the bear's like sergeants or whatever, and he had them on the train, right? So the players constrained the GM. The GM constrained the players to a literal railroad. They were on a railroad train. And together, by making these very severe constraints on each other, they generated such a great story that all of the players at the table agreed, and I agree, that of that series, that was the best episode they did. It was the most constrained, and it gave the best story by giving each other very strict parameters on what we're going to roleplay about. They were able to do really cool stuff that all worked to make a story, right? And if you think back to the idea of cinematic roleplay, which I think I've referenced earlier, and how one of the players in this same talkback talked about how hard it is to get an actual cinematic scene to play out in a role-playing game, because cinematic scenes tend to take planning, and you have to foreshadow things, right? They were able to get this to be cinematic by kind of foreshadowing that the bear is here, and that they've all heard that the bear is here, and some of them are looking for him. And the boxer was actually trying to avoid the conflict because he thought that they were getting into too much trouble, and he was trying to avoid it. And so later on, when they actually went to confront the bear, he said, "I'm not going to go." And he stayed behind. And then as as a player, Gaurav Galati, who played Hal Melton, the character that stayed behind, had to come up with a reason why he was now going to like, oh, all right, fine, I'll go help them. Right? He like when they didn't come back right away, he said, all right, I get nervous. My character gets nervous, and he's going to go help them. Right? And so, and again, that was an additional constraint that Gaurav put on his character, saying that my character isn't going to just do this, right? And so, by placing these very severe constraints on each other, they gave each other more ability to generate a really great story. This episode was not about leniency and flexibility, it was about constraints. Now, yes, Jordan Cowman's a very good GM, and he will let the players do all kinds of cool stuff. Now, fortunately, Savage Worlds allows it, right? You can do anything as a test, and so all the players have to do is tell them they want to do a test, and like Jordan will say things like they'll say, "Well, I want to run up to the guy, and I want to like flash my torch in his face and try and distract him." And Jordan Callerman, the GM, will say, "This sounds like a test. What kind of a test do you want to do? I think this sounds like a fighting test." And the player will agree, "Okay, I'll do a fighting test." And then the player rolls fighting, and Jordan rolls agility, and whoever wins the roll wins. So if the player rolls higher, then he gets the torch in the guy's face and it blinds him, and he says, "Okay, do you want to be distracted or vulnerable?" Because Savage Worlds allows that, right? A lot of other games don't have that mechanic, so they do have the freedom to do that sort of thing. But they still follow all the rules, right? And they still have to make their skill rolls and use their bennies to re-roll and all of that stuff. They don't take any of those rules away. They use certain house rules for playing live, that the audience can actually give them essentially something like weak bennies. They're called Curse Spanish Gold, and they work like bennies to let them do re-rolls. And they do allow that, and that's not obviously rules as written, right? But they still have rules for how those are used, and they don't change those rules in the middle of the game, right? They're only allowed to use, when they use the Curse Spanish Gold, it does a re-roll, but then the GM gets it, right? And he doesn't just say, "Okay, this time I won't take it, because it would be cool if I didn't." No, they follow their own rules, which is great. And so they have these constraints, and they follow the rules, and they come up with amazing stories, including the story that was so good that every one of them named it as their favorite episode in the entire series. And it was the most constrained. They had the least amount of freedom to just make up whatever random stuff they wanted, but they had tons of freedom to make up what they wanted within the constraints. And this is the key, guys. By saying to Dom, "You're on top of a train," I'm constraining your character to being on top of a moving train in the middle of the night on the caboose for a reason that you will state, right? You can't not be on the caboose. You can't not be on the train. It can't be daytime, right? All of these constraints, and it's going down the tracks, and you're here for a purpose. By giving Dom that constraint, right? He then Dom within that constraint could do anything he wanted as long as it fell within the borders of the parameters that Jordan Callerman, the GM, had produced, right? It's the same thing like when you make up a character, right, in D&D or something like that, and you build a race and a class, and you say, "Oh, well, this is constraints." But you can do anything. You make a ranger, you can do anything you want within the parameters outlined by the ranger, right? So within the constraint of the abilities of rangers, you can make up anything you want. And there are literally an infinite number of possible rangers that you could make. All the constraint does is give you some boundaries to help you figure out just exactly what it is that you're going to do with your ranger. And so, folks, my recommendation to you is, instead of shunning constraints or complaining about the constraints or asking to have constraints lifted, asking for leniency, and asking for flexibility, embrace the constraints. Recognize that by giving you constraints, the game system or the game master or the other players have given you an opportunity to generate narrative, right? Your almost all narrative after the initial opening is reaction to what came before. The constraints are what you're reacting to, right? I'm on the train. Now, how do I react? Right? I'm in the train car. How do I react? You're surrounded by enemies. How do you react? Right? Instead of saying, but I don't want to be surrounded by the enemies because I want to run away, and if I run away and I'm surrounded by enemies, I'll take all these attacks of opportunities. Okay, then how does your character react? You might surrender. Oh, he lost the battle. Well, so what? It's just roleplay. It's just imagination. So now you roleplay the prison moment. I mean, go watch, and I recommend this, the solo roleplay of KillTenRats. It's called Knave, the very first episode. He could do whatever he wanted, but he constrained himself. All right? And what he said was, we're starting in a prison. So here you have a player, he's solo gaming. Solo. He can do anything he wants. And he chose to start with a character in prison. Why? Because it's interesting. It gave him constraints. And then there were all these tables he rolled on. What kind of character is this? And he rolled up a female orc, which I don't think he expected to be playing. But he didn't say, I want to re-roll. He didn't cut the video and roll again and do like 5 takes until he got the character he wanted, which was like a human fighter or something. No, he went with what the dice said. And it gave him constraints. And then from those constraints, he generated a really cool story of this orc who is part of a tribe, and she has like an inheritance, and she's doesn't want the responsibility, so she left the orc lands, and based on the oracle rolls, there's an emissary from the orcs who's come to take her from prison and bring her back to the orc lands to assume her role as whatever heir of whatever she is. And so these are all constraints that the player put on himself as his own GM. He kept imposing constraints on himself because that's how you build a story. He didn't say, it can be anything. He started with prison. The most constrained you can be. Shackled in a prison with a beam of light as the only source of visibility, and emaciated, hasn't been fed well, doesn't have her weapons, doesn't have her armor. Chained up. I mean, you cannot get more constrained than that. And he purposely chose to start his roleplay as constrained as you can be. And it generated a great story. Again, ask yourself, why did he do this? He didn't have to do it, right? But being his own very good GM, he realized that giving myself as a GM these constraints that I will then have to play out as a player is a way to make it interesting. And go watch any solo play. You can watch my Ironsworn and Starforge. You can watch KillTenRats. You can watch, there's a, what is it, Three Skulls something. I can't remember. I just started watching it. Forbidden Lands. You can watch Trevor Duvall. Every single one of those folks has all these random number generators and oracles. And what are those things? They are constraints, right? Why did this happen? You know, we roll on the fate chart, and it says, yes, something happened. Well, what like an event, a random event happened. Let's roll on event, subject, and meaning, or whatever it is, subject and verb, whatever it is that they do. And I can't remember. It's the equivalent of action and theme, right? Rolling action and theme for Ironsworn. And it gives you respect life. And you're like, okay, what does that mean in this context? That phrase, or deny existence, right? Deny existence is a constraint on the scene. Something about this scene has to have something to do with denying existence. And now you have to stop and think about, what would that be? And by denying existence in the scene, that generates the story that leads you to the next part of the scene or to the next scene. right? So the constraints are what you use as building blocks like Legos to generate a scene that you can use for narrative. And so I think, folks, you shouldn't think about constraints as harming you. You should think about the constraints as helping you. There's a destination you're trying to get to, which is the climax of the scene, right? Off in the distance, time-wise. And the only way to get to a climax off in a certain direction, the only way to go in a specific direction is to follow a path. And I'm not talking about railroading, but I'm saying is follow a direction. Constraints. And as you're building the scene, you start out being able to go any which way, right? But as you build the scene, you find out there's a wall here, so you got to turn around. And then you find out there's a wall here, so you got to turn around. So you find out there's a wall here, so you got to turn around. And it turns out this is the only way you could go. And this is where the narrative is leading you. Over to the hospital. Somebody's sick. And now we have a story, right? The constraints produce the story for you. So folks, instead of railing against constraints or being upset when the GM or the game system give you parameters within which you have to roleplay, embrace the constraints. Recognize that these are helping you make a story. Be happy for them rather than frustrated by them. And I do recommend anybody who is frustrated by constraints, watch KillTenRats. Watch Me, Myself, and Die. Watch any other Let's Play, especially if you see Let's Plays. It doesn't have to be mine. Mine's, I'm not that great at it, I'll admit. But you can watch my Ironsworn and Starforged. You can watch, again, Trevor Duvall. You can watch KillTenRats. He does Ironsworn and Starforged as well as Knave. There are a whole bunch. You just Google Ironsworn Let's Plays. There are dozens of people who have excellent ones. In a Bad Spot does a great one. And every single one of these people are setting constraints, often very severe constraints, on themselves to help generate story. So use that as your inspiration for your own role play. Accept the constraints, embrace the constraints, and use them to help you build a narrative. That's my rant for today. Until next time, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been City of Heroes on the Rebirth server. Let's rant with Scrapperlock.